Hey there everyone. Today I'm starting a video which is going to be part of a series of about 15 or so other videos giving a literature review summary of Thomas Pynchon's secondary literature. I've read a few of Pynchon's works thus far, The Crying of Lot 49, Gravity's Rainbow, and Mason and Dixon, and I certainly plan on reading more. But as I've decided to go back and reread Gravity's Rainbow again, I thought, okay, before I do that, I'm really going to dig in to the secondary literature, to literary criticism, to academic studies of Gravity's Rainbow in particular, but also just Pynchon and his style and his influence and, his precedents and whatnot as well. And I thought that I would just put out a series of videos summarizing certain pieces of secondary literature to hopefully sift through this academic mass and give you something to chew on, such that if you want to read Pynchon or read Pynchon again, because Pynchon, like no other author, suits himself to rereads, I want to make it easier for you to just have at your fingertips on the internet some stuff on the academic space of Thomas Pynchon studies. And I was inspired by Chris Vive from Leaf by Leaf. His video on Gravity's Rainbow is about 3 hours long, and it has within it not only him going through his reading notes and giving a summary, but also going through secondary literature, and I really like that. So in this first video, we're going to be going through Peter L. Cooper's book, Signs and Symptoms, Thomas Pynchon in the Contemporary World. And there are 7 chapters in this book, and I've just kind of taken out of this, I've taken about 45-ish pages of good stuff that I want to talk about that can kind of give you the highlights of this. This will probably be the longest one. Everything else, the essays are between 4 and 35 pages or so, so should be much more manageable. But that being said, let's just get right into it. Now, in this first essay, Cooper is talking about Pynchon's literary context, trying to situate him in terms of what is going on at the time in the 60s and 70s when Pynchon is writing, because Cooper publishes this in 83. So this is 10 years after Gravity's Rainbow has been published. It is before Vineland has been published, or Mason and Dixon, or Against the Day, or Bleeding Edge, or Inherent Vice, or any of these other kind of later works. So this is mainly focused on The Crying of Lot 49 and Gravity's Rainbow as novels, and then also, Morality and Mercy in Vienna, as well as Slow Learner and a couple of his other nonfiction works. But he makes this distinction between, instead of modernism and postmodernism, which that term is rife with confusion and ambiguity, and in the next video we'll be doing a really great review of an essay regarding postmodernism and how Pynchon intersects with this, which I really like. But I do like Cooper's distinction, which is not his own, this exists in academia already, between realism and counter-realism. And the realists are trying to give the universe in microcosm in a way where it is a fairly faithful representation. It's kind of a traditional outlook on what fiction is supposed to do. It is supposed to provide some direct image of the world in miniature that very clearly states its message. But with the counter-realists, there is what Cooper says is a general uncertainty about the reality and hospitableness of the world, a fascination, sometimes horrified, with epistemological dilemmas, a recognition of the need for fictional versions of reality, and a simultaneous apprehension of their dangers and insufficiencies that leads to narrative disruptions and to self-parody. And this is one of the defining aspects of Pynchon's writing in particular, but he also mentions Kurt Vonnegut, and you can even see this sometimes in Joyce, not usually, but also John Barth, William Burroughs. What they're trying to do is subvert what narrative is traditionally trying to do. It is bled and bred with uncertainties regarding what literature is actually capable of doing. And this leads to structure and form and content and characters and plot being sometimes ambiguous, shallow, and Cooper points out that oftentimes Pynchon's characters are critiqued for being too shallow, for their motives being ambiguous and things like this. But Cooper writes that unlike more realistic characters, they're not supposed to grow, develop, or expose themselves to revelation. Their limitations reveal how puny and ineffectual they are before the plots and power structures of the world, or the indifference, perhaps hostility, of the cosmos. The characters seem unreal, even to themselves, because they're impotent in the face of conscious manipulation or chaotic circumstance. And that's one of the things that you're going to see as Pynchon problematizes the traditional notion of characters, is that they have their own self-insurities, sure. But usually when we read a work of fiction, we have that perspective of the omniscient narrator, and we have that kind of dramatic bird's eye view where we can see past what they cannot. But Pynchon blends these two together in a way where we too are succumbing to the same kind of plots and unsureties that the characters face. And regarding humor, this kind of connects with Pynchon's project at large. He says, as in other black humor novels, especially Pynchon's, such contrary perspectives deny the reader any stable vantage point from which he can order his responses to the world. The author undercuts the reader's sense of security and complacency as much as that of any character, by juxtaposing comic strip humor with grisly, realistically depicted horrors. And I think that's really interesting, especially in Gravity's Rainbow, because you can get these really humorous moments laced within, for example, the Mittelwerk concentration camp, stuff like that, and talking about the stacked bodies of people who are about to be thrown into the crematoriums. It's this really stark and really brutal vision in which we really have this collapsing of high and the low, which is one of the kind of hallmarks of postmodernism. And he says that regarding the intersection between like Burroughs and stuff like that, he says Burroughs sees fiction as potentially akin to the thought control conspiracies of his senders on Dr. Benway, and so he advocates and practices a kind of guerrilla warfare on the entrapping form. He introduces spontaneity and accident with his cut-up method, hacking apart and rearranging the declarative sentence. That sentence he vilifies as an outgrowth and perpetuation of Aristotelian either-or thinking, a shackle to the Western mind. Expanding his suspicion of logical structure beyond the sentence, he destroys plotline, narrative continuity, and consistent point of view in his novels. The fragmentary episodes of Naked Lunch may not even be bound by parallel relation, as are the episodes of Gravity's Rainbow. And I think that's really important because this is a slight digression, of course, but the point is that Burroughs represents this radical opposition, this anti or this contra perspective towards either or thinking, towards rational analysis, towards the consistency and structure of narratives. And if you read Naked Lunch, I mean, it is one of the most disjointed, destructured, intentionally destructured pieces of fiction I've ever read, much more so than any of Pynchon's works. And Pynchon, too, is kind of, he's riding this line where he will take advantage of structure. For Burroughs, there's a very active attempt to annul all structure, to get out from underneath the thought control conspiracies. But if you read Pynchon, for example, oftentimes his characters, and as well the narrator, are going to entertain paranoid conspiracies. So there is some understanding of either or thinking as a necessary corollary to life, but Pynchon will play with that and say that, okay, you have an either-or decision over here, and you have another either-or decision over here. Maybe you can have both of these at the same time, or maybe there's some ambiguity latent within each of these, such that you can take advantage of both of them. Cooper continues, Pynchon, too, inveighs against either-or thinking, analysis, and classification, and he suspects that organized plots threaten the free, spontaneous workings of life and the imagination. He too has compared reality to theater. You can see the opening page of Gravity's Rainbow for that. And to a film that the audience cannot or will not recognize as such. And he is wary of being trapped inside a confining delusion. He too sees salvation or possibility in the unstructured. His Osby feel, this is from Gravity's Rainbow, in Battle Cry, we piss on their rational arrangements. But Pynchon also speaks of assertion through structure, which he practices. He makes the reader seek meaningful patterns and thus imitate his characters. And that's one of the real great things about Pynchon is you really must empathize with his characters on a fundamental level insofar as you have to undergo the same confusions and the same searchings that the characters have to go through. So you too have to insert yourself into the narrative, and you have to fill it up just as these characters do with their imaginative confusions. Cooper writes, the counter-realists on the middle ground and even those at the extremes feel the simultaneous need to make and unmake fictional structures. Thus they can escape enclosing form, acknowledge that certainty or final versions are impossible, or simply enjoy the play of mind. And one should keep in mind the preliminary title of Gravity's Rainbow was Mindless Pleasures. So there's this sort of, half-assed, almost kind of frivolous attitude, this irreverent attitude, in which we are kind of making a joke out of the notion of form itself. He says the characters try to discover, interpret, or verify, not objective reality, but an artistic reinvention of the world. Copies are needed to replace the gradual fading, decomposing original. But like Oedipus' active metaphor, copies can lead or mislead, clarify the form and meaning of the original, or impose a false surface that offers its own delights and insights while obscuring those of the original. In raising these questions about pictorial art, the long and convoluted novel makes some discoveries about its own art form. And that's something really cool about Pynchon's work, is it is so self-referential. It is constantly commenting on itself. You'll often see the narrator, especially in Gravity's Rainbow, sort of fold over itself or himself or themselves, because sometimes there are multiple narrators that comment on each other. And there is this sort of convoluted self-understanding that's happening, where you constantly have self-interpretation over top a meta self-interpretation, over top another meta self-interpretation. So it's very conceptual, very difficult, but again, this is really harkening back to the same sort of things that the characters are trying to struggle with, is you need to impose some order on the world, but that order, oftentimes it's difficult to know to what extent is it a self-imposition and to what extent has it been imposed from the outside. And that's something his characters will always struggle with. And there's always this kind of light-hearted approach in Pynchon to himself, to his readers. And it's not necessarily like he's just lambasting his readers and trying to treat them like they're stupid. No, he does invite you in too. But it is a central aspect of Pynchon's style that it is, as Cooper calls it, the literature of self-parody, which is from Richard Poirier. And Richard Poirier says it makes fun of itself as it goes along. It proposes not the rewards so much as the limits of its own procedures. It shapes itself around its own dissolvents. It calls into question not any particular literary structure so much as the enterprise, the activity itself of creating any literary form, of empowering an idea with style. And that's nice that there's a sort of dissimulation of the supremacy of any one style. Pynchon is really great at his infamous pastiche, where he's literally just emulating the style of sports journalism or comic books or like Godzilla movies. There's like a giant adenoid that kind of mimics the Godzilla movie kind of thing in the first part of Gravity's Rainbow, which I always thought was really funny. And Pynchon is not necessarily treating these like they're less than. It's always self-parodying itself and asking, okay, if I use this style, is it going to be better for this, better for this, better for this? And there's not necessarily, sometimes you wonder, should it really be said this way? Couldn't it be said another way? And Pynchon would probably say yes. There is no absolute reason why you ought to choose one style to deliver a message over another. But they, of course, all have their own kind of gravitational pulls, right? They're going to shift certain things in and out of focus. Cooper says that the counter-realists who enjoy the sport and liberation of self-parody often build their fictions around not one, but a number of literary modes and subgenres, or even non-literary materials, all of which they exploit but also mock and undercut. Thus, they suggest the multiplicity and inadequacy of possible perspectives. Barthelme and Pynchon bring in everything from myth to comic book to fairy tale to pornography. And I really like that because it makes this kind of literature always extremely stimulating, asking you to come out of your perspective and really engage with a truly perspectival mode of representation. Not literature that's going to give you the image of being able to be in someone's head, but actually not. No, you genuinely have to undergo the same sort of affects as the characters, and that self-parody is naturally going to lend itself to the reader sometimes feeling a little stupid. Cooper says that the counter-realists are going to employ a variety of methods to involve their readers in the same confusions and epistemological problems that their characters face within fictional worlds. Pynchon and Barth make the reader go on a difficult quest for meaning, make him search through a particularly realized, or partially realized, gradually emerging pattern of tenuously related events. At least it seems to be a pattern. The reader may feel uncertain because he's often seduced into seeking correlation and seeing correlation as causation, arcane fact as fantasy. He shares the character's peak or even their sense of release and renewed possibility at being unable to verify any version of reality. For these elaborate counter-realistic works make him sense that his own version is but another unverifiable, imperfect fiction. And I like that because, and we'll talk about this as we get more into his understanding of science, but because science has to accept, modern scientists with the oncoming of like quantum theory and certain aspects of electromagnetism, we have to accept a lot of the ambiguities in the universe that occur on the, for example, the quantum level, on this extreme micro level, that we weren't ready to do before. And as such, there's a sort of taking down a peg science and bringing into the foreground things like astrology, for example, which on a very literal basis is obviously not true. It's a pseudoscience, and it's as good as guessing as far as I'm concerned. But Pynchon will imbue it with a partially realized, partially opened door mentality to learning something about the characters in their universe. And I think that's really cool because it asks you to give the benefit of the doubt to different perspectives. It really is profoundly democratic in that sense, or at least empathetic. Cooper says that the fictions of Nabokov and Pynchon are similar in this respect, that both exploit the compulsive tendency we have as human beings, and especially as readers, to look at phenomena and see meaningful patterns that perhaps do not objectively exist. Both build narratives upon a web of echoes, reflections, and repeated details that seem to be interlocking clues. One never knows for certain if they are. With this tantalizing web of partial revelation, both inveigle the reader into mimicking solipsistic and paranoid protagonists who isolate themselves even more profoundly in the course of their epistemological quests. And both withhold from the reader any final certainty, any firm ground of knowledge, any sure means for determining reality. In the Heisenbergian terms Pynchon employs, both arrange things so that one cannot even tell to what degree subjective influences have perturbed the events one observes. Also, while remaining skeptical, both accord a metaphoric validity to the fabrications of the protagonists. a validity that Nabokov calls special reality, and Pynchon the truth of a true lie. This validity is perhaps the only reality and truth available. Consequently, both writers evince some ambivalence about fabricated designs and envisioned meanings, such as fictional plots, and so both employ parody and self-parody to keep themselves uncommitted. And that's important, this notion of uncommitment, because with postmodernism is going to come the distrust of your traditional grand historical narratives. The traditional liberation narrative, for example, in Pynchon, is undercut by the fact that the counterculture movement of the 60s and early 70s kind of failed. If you look at, for example, May 68, it didn't do what it wanted to do. It was sort of absorbed back into these hierarchical autocratic bureaucracies in a way that, maybe gave some advances, but in the long run, for Pynchon, it represents the fall of modern civilization, of contemporary civilization, to corporate interests and to aristocratic desires and things like that. And as a result, individual plans to just confront reality as it really is. For Pynchon, that as it really is laced with problems because always there are, for example, CIA plots that border on paranoid conspiracy, but they are in fact real, in such a way that the line between fiction and reality is useful to perturb, and perturb to an uncertain degree, such that even Pynchon may not always be sure what he's doing, but he certainly has a tremendous awareness that you can't deny when you read his works. He certainly is aware of the way that things are going to be perceived. Cooper says that whereas Nabokov's intricate patterns compose a realm of non-utilitarian delight, Pynchon's point back to the communal world and make rather didactic statements about historical conspiracies, economic oppression, social entropy, and so forth. One senses a need in Pynchon to relate true lies back to some shared reality, to find something in them that mattered to the world, as Oedipus says. Consequently, Pynchon often makes it hard to distinguish the border between his invented plots and actual historical events or scientific experimentation. And it's an undeniable fact that when you're reading Pynchon, you are faced with pseudo-historical or partially historical events sometime. I think a perfect kind of novel in and of itself for looking at this is Mason and Dixon, because it is much more connected to historical events. It occurs more directly on the back of historical events, I would say, than Gravity's Rainbow, for example, which of course has a lot to do with the Herero genocide and the disillusion of Nazi rule after World War II and the development of the V2 and all this stuff that's very much real. But in Mason and Dixon, you see very much a real need to, for example, confront the horrors of slavery and confront its imminent relation to the present, that it is not something gone, but that it has lingering effects, and that it can sort of cascade beyond its supposed domain of reality, right? Of it was a historical fact, but is no longer anymore. No, Pynchon is trying to connect reality in this sort of trans-temporal way, such that the true lies of, for example, manipulating the narrative, such that you have, Scepter, the eel, in Mason and Dixon, the electric eel, and everyone's fascinated with him because everyone's fascinated with electricity, or the giant robot duck that turns invisible and all this sort of stuff. Just this crazy, outlandish stuff serves to actually get us back to some sort of shared reality that we are responding to, which I really like because there is still that activism kind of latent within Pynchon's project. You can tell that he wants us to say something about this. He doesn't just want us to pontificate necessarily. Cooper states that Pynchon and Barth see the world as an extremely complex, endlessly ramifying mental construct. Reality, quote-unquote, as subjective and multiple. Any version of it will inevitably be incomplete. Any epistemological inquiry or artistic rendition will fall short. Hence, in their fictions, self-parody accompanies heterogeneity and encyclopedic all-inclusiveness. Both affirm that there is much to know and no chance really to know it. And that very much connects to contemporary society of this overflow of information with, it used to just be, we had a lot of information in literal encyclopedias. I think of the French encyclopedists, which are parodied in Mason and Dixon. But now we have the internet and this overflow of information such that, especially like if you look at the news coverage of something like the Israel-Palestine conflict, for example, there are many different perspectives of what is reality, and some of them will form such all-encompassing systems with their own. For example, you'll have the Israeli government paying people to pay lip service to Israeli war crimes on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube and things like that. So they'll get paid by the Ministry of Information to kind of do advertising for their political plots. So there's always this inevitable incompleteness in every perspective. Not to say that every perspective is equally correct, but that each perspective has the possibility to bring us to new ways of envisioning and conceptualizing the world. And in his artistic renditions of the world, there is almost a willingness to not try to add up to capital R reality. There's a focus on kind of splicing reality apart and bringing it into a bunch of shattered pieces that can just be content to exist without having to be dialectical, in the sense of needing to achieve some sort of Hegelian synthesis. No. It's very similar to Jean Baudrillard saying the world is, or history is not dialectical, it is sworn to extremes. Pynchon kind of embraces that, swearing himself to extremes with this inevitable incompleteness and uncertainty, which kind of mirrors, for example, the Heisenbergian uncertainty principle and things like this. But there is not necessarily a inherently a priori vainness in creating these fictional narratives. Cooper writes that Pynchon knows that man embroiders plots to fill the epistemological gap between himself and the unknowable. But he does not suggest that we purely design self-reflective fictions where the only norm is aesthetic bliss or intellectual sport. Nor does he suggest that his own fictions are such endeavors. Moreover, he seems unsure that the plots one creates are entirely one's own, that one is in control or is even aware of the shaping mechanism. While registering a profound uncertainty and seeing the need for alternative realities, Pynchon keeps trying, as do some of his characters, to decode the ominous logic of reality and to make his fictions reflect it. And that's important because of his relationship to historical anomalies. You'll see, for example, some very interesting anachronisms in Mason and Dixon, where you'll have kind of 20th century stuff happening in the kind of mid to late 18th century. All of this is trying to show the relevance of these trans-historical facts to getting us out of the solipsism of, everything is just unknowable, I'll just throw my hands up and I'll just do like what Nabokov does, and I'll just make this purely isolated system of aesthetic bliss, as Cooper puts it. No, instead, there is a recognition that there is some sort of outside shaping mechanism. That is what capital T they is in Gravity's Rainbow. We just don't exactly know what it is. But Pynchon does seem to suggest that there may potentially be some validity, or at least some pragmatic utility, in anchoring ourselves to something, even if it is not entirely true. And Cooper speaks of all the different groups that show up, for example. And I think this is a really interesting aspect to get to the social aspect of Pynchon's writing, which testifies to the implicit communal theory, the anti-solipsism of his work. Cooper writes that these bizarre groups appear randomly scattered across the social landscape. Each seems to have an internal logic, consistent in its own terms but unrelated to those of other groups. There is no common context or set of terms, no informing whole that unifies the groups into a coherent society. They would be eccentric, but there is no center from which to deviate. Rudolf Arnheim's notion of entropy describes this condition. In its intermediate stages, entropic dissolution reveals not complete randomness, but disorder, quote, the clash of uncoordinated orders, limited and randomly dispersed. Pynchon's Nueva York, San Narciso, or the Zone appear as disorder moving toward the advanced stage of entropy, characterized by Vaishu in V, total barrenness, stillness, and indistinction. And that's always a looming threat for Pynchon. That's kind of what the rocket represents. This sort of apocalyptic approach, which, yes, has the possibility to restructure things, but only after a fatal outcome of some kind. And there is some hope that these characters can find some sort of grounding narrative, not an absolute narrative, but something to ground their everyday affairs that might stave off that. And there is no ultimate perspective to choose, and there is certainly an eccentricity, as Cooper says, but we're unsure exactly where that center is, where exactly we should be grounded, what exactly reality is composed of. And as such, there appears to be just these isolated systems with no relation to each other. But especially as you reread Pynchon's works, you'll see that, for example, completely seemingly unrelated things on opposite sides of the novel actually start to resonate with one another in a really interesting way. Cooper continues, apart from having no physical center, the city, quote unquote, also lacks an intelligent shaping principle to control its development. The narrator dubs San Narciso grotesque, and so it is in the traditional sense defined by Wolfgang Kaiser, as discussed above. Exemplifying Montaigne's use of grotesque, it is monstrous, pieced together from the most diverse members without distinct form, in which order and proportion are left to chance. And of course the question is it really chance, or is there some sort of mechanism? Certainly Pynchon will vacillate between the two. Cooper continues that San Narciso appears as a weird assemblage of autolots, escrow services, drive-ins, small office buildings and factories, beige, prefab, cinder block office machine distributors, sealant makers, bottled gasworks, fastener factories, warehouses, and whatever. And I like these questions that Cooper wants the reader to ask. Is there a definitive vantage point in this relativistic universe? If so, what are the standards for determining it? One solves little by choosing the human vantage point, even if one chooses arbitrarily, and for no other reason than that one is human, for the human perspective entails imagination, and so comprises every view from microscopic to telescopic. Where within that range should one position oneself, and why? And that's very interesting because Pynchon does strike me as profoundly post-humanistic. The world is not subservient to human needs. In fact, Pynchon shows the outcome of that sort of mentality, the destructive technologies such as the V-2 rocket and nuclear technology. Also mass surveillance technology, which is sort of the ultimate self-critique of humanity's desires. So there is an understanding that by putting into his novel all sorts of other perspectives, such as, for example, he asks us to empathize with the perspective of a rock, whose time scale is millions of years or something like that. In such a situation, Pynchon is showing that there is the possibility to actually empathize and adopt such a perspective. So the quote-unquote human vantage point can analogously adopt most, if not possibly, this is Pynchon's question, all other vantage point. As such, Cooper writes, far from being an independent observer of the system around him, he must recognize that even the time and space intervals he employs are variables of the system to which he applies them. No free and absolute reference points exist. And that's important because this connects to, for example, understanding general relativity, where inertial reference frames are key for coming to know anything about the world. Werner Heisenberg, of the famous Heisenberg uncertainty principle, writes that the object of research is no longer nature in itself, but rather nature exposed to man's questioning, and to this extent, man here also meets himself. So these ambiguities that Heisenberg sees in physics, Pynchon is going to take from physics and broaden to give us a sort of common cosmic understanding of uncertainty everywhere. Cooper writes that one cannot determine the degree of subjective influence because one can never know what objective reality was before the attempt to observe it. In short, one cannot see the object by itself or even learn where the subject leaves off and the object begins. With small systems, as Spectro said of large systems, one cannot tell inside from outside. And this is important because this connects to, for example, the understanding of quantum mechanics, which there are multiple understandings, and I think that speaks to Pynchon's perspectival understanding of literature and the human condition and reality itself. We know that before we are actually perceiving a quantum particle, because it exists below a certain threshold of size, if we try to actually observe it, first off, there is the Heisenbergian uncertainty principle of the momentum and the position of a quantum particle. One increases while the other decreases, so they are inversely proportional to one another, such that there is always an inherent ambiguity. But also, before we observe that particle, we can only talk about it probabilistically in terms of its wave function, of where we can predict it will be blank % of the time. So now there is randomness built into our perception of the universe. Now, Cooper continues that Pynchon writes not only about the lines of force or patterns of relation that shape the world, but also about the attempts of the conscious mind to perceive them. Yet the perceiving mind, he tells us, is part of the system, itself one of the lines of force that is shaped, molded, and limited by the others, which it shapes, molds, and limits in return. The act of observing alters the field of which the observer is a part. Consequently, he, defined by his relation to elements in the field, is altered itself, and so the reciprocal process continues. Pynchon's characters have no independent criteria for judging their discoveries. As David Hawkins notes in his book on scientific epistemology, the very knowledge by which we can justify our inductive procedures must itself be a product of those procedures. If one is working through a maze, there is no supra-maze knowledge. Subjective influences and limitations are impossible to control, measure, or transcend. And Pynchon several times complicates the problem of interpreting and assessing one's interpretation by citing Gödel's incompleteness theorem, a mathematical demonstration that one cannot prove any logical system free from contradictions by using only corollaries derived from the premises. One must get outside the system. In human terms, one can verify one's own perceptions only by perceiving some validation outside them. This, of course, cannot be done. Uncertainty is inescapable. So for modern thinkers like Kurt Gödel in mathematics, Percy Bridgman in science, Ludwig Wittgenstein in language, or Thomas Pynchon in literature, systems of knowledge and expression will always be unable to get beyond themselves and define their own grounds. And as such, they are confining as well as limited. James Clerk Maxwell said nearly as much as in 1873 when he wrote to Herbert Spencer, "It is very seldom that any man who tries to form a system can prevent his system from forming round him and closing him in." In that implosive capacity of language, that's something that Pynchon talks about with the metaphor of gravity. Because, for example, Einstein's understanding of gravity in general relativity, because a space-time continuum causes local gravitational, or is affected by local gravitational shifts, such that we constantly have this curved space-time continuum. For Einstein, this was going to actually fold around itself. And this plays into the circle imagery and the cyclical imagery that we see a lot, as well as the Ouroboros imagery, right? And I think this is really interesting because it shows the profound limitations of getting outside one's perspective, and Pynchon's undesirability to try to get outside of that perspective. There's not this need for communal coming together in order to transcend one's limitations, but rather to enjoy taking advantage of and just soaking in those limitations themselves. Metaphor, Cooper writes, can, however, provide an experiential truth by defining how something is perceived, or an operational truth by allowing one to act in some accord with a pattern of events, even if one cannot know the details of that pattern or the substantive nature of its elements. Metaphor, thus, offers much of what a contemporary scientist hopes for in a theory. And that's an important thing. It is a sort of coherent model which allows us to understand the tendencies that we witness. Cooper continues that Pynchon's artistic relationship with science extends beyond his appropriation of concepts or hypotheses to include his self-consciousness about the act of description. The new science has revised expectations about the limits of knowledge and disclosure. Lincoln Barnett writes, "Science cannot yet really explain electricity, magnetism, and gravitation. Their effects can be measured and predicted, but of their ultimate nature, no more is known to the modern scientist than to Thales of Miletus, who first speculated on the electrification of amber around 585 BC. Most contemporary physicists reject the notion that man can ever disclose what these mysterious forces really are. Electricity, Bertrand Russell says, is not a thing like St. Paul's Cathedral. It is a way in which things behave." And Cooper continues that science still applies names to these forces to enable discussion of them. But Léon Brouillon notes that wise men know where and how to use these figures of language, and they are aware of their complete lack of reality. We could add their lack of exhaustibility. These unreal metaphors or theoretical symbols are liaisons with an outside world independent of us, not directly accessible to us. Our relations with it are mediated by our senses, if nothing else. And scientists, using unreal figures of language, imagine simplified models which serve us as representations of this inaccessible world. Gerald Holton explains further that first, the facts of observation impress themselves on our senses. Next, we find here a puzzling mixture of complexity and order which triggers curiosity. And finally, we resolve the apparent puzzle by the imaginative construction of an analogon, which is successful if it correlates convincingly the puzzling element in the observations with the consequences of the postulated structure of the analogon. And I really like that because this is just straight up pragmatism, right? We are finding a correlative and coherent model that explains the world and has some sort of practical consequences for our mapping of the world. And there is a sort of practical consistency of its own for Pynchon's novels, for his worlds that he constructs. There is a need, a very active need, to struggle against the uncertainties of the world and try to find some mapping model. This is the same just as in the real world as it is in Pynchon fiction. So he really takes us into his head and into his characters' heads to actually try and figure out how to map this landscape. Cooper continues that science, of course, does not deal purely in projections and subjectivity, nor does Stenzel from Morality and Mercy in Vienna. Something is there to be investigated and described, but one must adopt a new attitude toward investigation and description. The aim of science, announced Henri Poincaré in 1905, is not things themselves, as the dogmatists in their simplicity imagine, but the relations between things. Outside these relations, there is no reality knowable. And this extends to, for example, the understanding of inertial reference frames in general relativity, that we have to understand the intersystematic relations, not try to get outside the system, but we have to understand the dynamics within the system such that we can give an adequate understanding of that particular perspective. And that's what Pynchon wants to do. He wants to get inside the perspective of the these psychologists, inside the minds of the esotericists or the mythicists, or inside the minds of the Nazis. All of these different perspectives. Cooper continues, Bertrand Russell adds that physics is quite unable to tell us what things are like in themselves, although it may describe patterns of events with great fidelity. To the limits suggested by Heisenberg, Bohr, Poincaré, Russell, and company, science can use mathematics and unreal, quote-unquote, metaphors to describe, measure, and predict the behavior and relations of the unknowable entities as they interact with subjective influences. Right? So there is the necessity for some sort of outside world, ontologically, but it is the uncertainty, epistemologically, of that world that is played with in Pynchon's writings. And this itself is an ontological commentary on the fundamental nature, not just as a consequence of our limited understanding, but the very essence of reality itself is to essentially be without a definable essence at any one time. We can only talk in structures. The paranoid model builder, Cooper says, must make a rather daring leap of faith in asserting a continuity between events. And he mentions that Mark Siegel has compared this act to the existentialist leap of faith in his Pynchon Creative Paranoia and Gravity's Rainbow, which we will look at later in this series. Does he delude himself in doing so, entrap himself in a structure of his own making? The pattern tracer thus opens himself up to the dangers of solipsism. Pynchon seems to say that we must take that risk. We cannot help but enclose ourselves within our own perceptions anyway, regardless of how discontinuous they are. And moreover, we cannot help but fabricate to some uncertain degree what we perceive, if for no other reason than that our act of observing alters what we observe. And we might add that we are unsure exactly the extent to which our effects of observation change the preceding reality to the reality post-observation. At worst, Cooper says, the paranoid only alters what he observes more radically than the average person does. Anti-paranoia can be even harder to bear than paranoia. As Slothrop slides into anti-paranoia, he feels the whole city around him going back roofless, vulnerable, uncentered as he is in only pasteboard images now. Paranoia, rather than anti-paranoia, lends the more accurate vision of a world in which interlocking economic, political, and military interests persecute the likes of Slothrop. There is a plot directed at him, and paranoia at least alerts him to it. Reality, quote-unquote, may appear in discrete quanta, frames of film, or fragmentary clues, but the paranoid makes them continuous. He traces the lines between the dots to reveal the pattern, or at least some pattern, we might add. He could be totally wrong about journalistic particulars, such as who, what, when, and where, and still provide an accurate analog of events. His model could be metaphorically apt. I think that's really interesting, that metaphorically we might be getting at the same structure, even if the particulars, if the content is itself different, indeed made up. In Pynchon's terms, Cooper writes, metaphorical constructs, paranoid visions, or projected worlds are really just fabricated coordinate systems. When taken provisionally, they offer a valid means of understanding the real world. If the same laws apply in the same way to patterns of events in each coordinate system, then a person can infer the general structure and operation of any world from the structure and operation of any other. Right? So there is an analogous base on which to oppose and interact with systems based on their formal relations between one another. This connects back, for example, to what I was saying about how Pynchon is going to entertain things like astrology or tarot cards, for example. Because, as Cooper says, just as these formal relations are going to give us some sort of way to analyze analogous systems, myth reveals a design in events that endures, even though the particulars do not. The form of reality persists, even though the content changes. And this is indeed how we talk about, for example, quantum phenomena. Even though there is on the quantum level an uncertainty about the content, about the particulars, inevitably and indubitably so, we can make large-scale formal predictions and models about how a quantum particle is going to interact with others, for example. We can talk about its wave function, and we can talk about how it works on the macro scale. This is why when we're on the macro scale, we can still use general relativity without much doubt. It works in the general. It's just that when we get to the particulars, we see that inevitable uncertainty. And thus, myth can provide an analogy, an overriding process, as Cooper says, that reveals itself in myriad shifting signs and various coordinate systems. Even if it exists, though, it cannot be isolated and explained by means of language. To try for such precision is to fall into the, quote, insanely endless diddling play of a chemist whose molecules are words. That's from Gravity's Rainbow, page 391 of the Viking. And yet linguistic combinations, like chemical reactions, can reflect the process in conforming to it. Enzian thinks there may be no gods, but there is a pattern. Names by themselves have no magic, but the act of naming, the physical utterance, obeys the pattern. One cannot name the pattern, but one can reveal or embody its form in the act of naming. This is similar to Wittgenstein's point that a sentence can represent but not say the form of reality. The names work not by precise objective reference, we might say representation, but by a sort of parallelism, a sympathetic magic, a repetition high and low of some prevailing form. That's from Gravity's Rainbow, page 232, which they can never directly articulate. Pynchon characters from Dennis Flange through Fausto Maegstral, Oedipus, and Enzian have always had to settle for this truth of a true lie. Pynchon has settled for it too. He writes fiction. Now, I really like this last chapter, Pynchon's fictional techniques, assertion through structure. I think this is a really good kind of way in terms of actually reading Pynchon and getting something out of him on a very specific level when it comes to reading. Cooper says that Pynchon weaves together plots in which his characters weave together plots. And that's something I've talked about in my lectures on Pynchon in the past, is that Pynchon is going to play on the double entendre latent in the word plot, which is to say, it is both a narrative structure and an organized conspiracy. And in the same way that the characters are present within a plot structure, as in a narrative technique, they are also beholden to a plot, an organized conspiracy. And it's as if Pynchon, who is supposed to be, the architect of this conspiracy, is unsure of it himself. It's as if he's making a metatextual critique of the autonomy and the absolute authority of the author himself, which I think is really interesting because it opens up Pynchon to so many avenues of interpretation. Cooper writes that uncertainty is not just a theme, it's also a technique, or rather an ultimate effect, that Pynchon achieves through all of his fictional techniques. A favorite stratagem is to build a weird story that strains the reader's willing suspension of disbelief, but to build it around a real phenomenon, an actual scientific experiment, or a verifiable bit of history that itself seems weirder than the fiction. As a result, the surreal proves real, and the real becomes surreal. And a perfect example of this is the Byron the Bulb episode near the end of Gravity's Rainbow in the fourth part. In that moment, we are met with the absurdity of the story, but also the absurdity of the fact that formally, and in fact in some of the particulars, for example, it mentions the Phoebus cartel, that is a real cartel that was controlling and bringing into being planned obsolescence as a way to maximize profits by lowering the efficiency of light bulbs. So we are met with a real piece of history, and we're met with it in such a way in which the fiction in many ways embodies and brings out the absurdity in reality itself. Thus, Cooper writes, the disquieting or even sinister uncertainty experienced by the characters extends to envelop the reader. The reader then tries to corroborate his sense of reality, or at least to orient himself within the fictional world, by finding some meaningful patterns in events. In this way, Pynchon makes the reader imitate the protagonist and live through a similar epistemological ordeal. And that is what I love about Pynchon, is you really get taken in. People love talking about how difficult Gravity's Rainbow is. It's supposed to be like that because life is difficult too. Just as, you're going to get anxiety in Gravity's Rainbow, life is filled with anxiety. And just as, for example, Oedipus in The Crying of Lot 49 is trying to bring all of these different patterns into confluence with one another, the reader does exactly the same thing. But Pynchon ensures that you can't get to a final perspective, and that's important. Cooper writes that the reader rarely brings a knowledge of all such bits of actuality to his first reading. Rather, he stumbles upon them accidentally while reading unrelated material, much as Oedipus stumbles on her clues. And this reinforces his suspicion, as it does hers, of a hidden network that intends to communicate and yet hides beneath the surface. But paradoxically, recognition of such real materials heightens the reader's sense of the novel's unreality, its artifice. Pynchon's verbal tapestry announces itself as a fiction, a fabrication, an intellectual game on the writer's part, a self-contained world with self-reflecting parts, a San Narciso, and a better formed one. Now, of course, we know that it's not a self-contained world. It is, in fact, existing in confluence and in conversation with the real world. But everything is so disjointed, so open-ended, that it might as well be self-contained, because there's very little energy by which to, explode outwards, to meet and transcend from itself to the real world. Cooper continues, yet the self-reflecting patterns somehow recall the patterns of this world and bring the reader back out of the fiction to contemplate public concerns such as the contemporary sociological problems that Pynchon broaches. The author interweaves the real world in his fictional one, but where does one leave off and the other begin? We may as well ask, when observing subatomic particles, where objective reality leaves off and subjective influence begins. Pynchon's technique is to make us always uncertain, always unable to say, and yet to seduce us into drawing connections just as the characters do. Connections which never illuminate or exhaust the mystery. And the subject of the book, our inevitable and always frustrated attempt to read meanings, is the experience of the book. That's brilliant. He blends the content of the book with the desired aesthetic effect, such that they can almost become isomorphic. They can fold over one another. And he mentions this web of echoes that occurs throughout, whether it's characters showing up in other novels, or he says such a web of echoes conduces to an eerie feeling of perpetual deja vu, a sense of some pattern revealing itself just beyond our conceptual horizons. In this way, The Crying of Lot 49 is not about the ominous logic, but rather conveys the attitudes, fears, and needs surrounding it. The book delivers not revelation, but rather the mood of revelation, of the dawning perception that everything is connected, everything in creation. And I really like that, because he's not necessarily focused on this almost business-centered way of, I need to solve this problem such that it can become useful. No, Pynchon is content to deliver you the mindset of somebody else and just let you experience something else. It really is something that literature can do very specially. And he continues, woven into a plot that could be miraculous or malign, it depends on the perceiver who partially constructs it. One feels the almost sublime terror of awareness touched by that otherworldly thing, forced to expand beyond its familiar scope and assimilate the knowledge that nothing is real or significant in itself. Significance lies only in relations that reverberate endlessly into the distance, over the edge of perception and understanding, beyond the ability of any one mind to register them and reliably interpret their meaning. And that goes for the narrator as well as the reader, as well as for any characters within here. No one perspective is going to be suitable enough. Cooper says that the mass and the gravity of Pynchon's plots often work to minimize, to flatten the characters caught in them. These figures seem bizarre, grotesque. They add to the reader's sense of uncertainty in an alien world. Pynchon has been faulted more than once for not making real characters, but, and this is what he said near the beginning, that Pynchon writes to undermine our complacent, familiar assumptions about reality. Why would he want to reinforce them through traditional methods of characterization? E.M. Forster defined a real character as one who seems explicable, even if he or she has not been fully explained. But Pynchon purposely creates worlds that are inexplicable, defiantly mysterious. And thus he makes us question our powers to know and explain any world, his or ours. And we might say that that applies to the real world too. Explicable characters would subvert his plan and clash with all of his other fictional methods. I really like this quote here. Gravity's Rainbow seems at times like a gargantuan X-rated comic book, filled with puny forms randomly colliding like subatomic particles. Two-dimensional figures racing about chaotically against a four-dimensional backdrop. The third dimension, home of traditional representational art, the middle ground, has been dropped. That's really interesting. You get a tremendous intimacy in, this is going to go into things like coprophagia, for example, or the banana breakfast near the beginning of the first part. This is all just kind of congealing together. There's not this sense of separation or this medium from which we can gain a stable look at the dynamics of the system. No, we're stuck in the system. He mentions that all these changes in characterization may correspond to changes in the conception of physical reality. Sir William Dampier observes that the hard, massy, ultimate particles of Lucretius and Newton have been resolved into complex systems of protons and whirling electrons, non-material, perhaps only to be represented by wave equations. In the light of relativity, matter has ceased to be something which persists in time and moves in space, and has become a mere system of interrelated events. Cooper continues after the quote that no longer hard, massy, ultimate particles, the characters, the matter of fiction, may seem less like whole, comprehensible, and consistent entities than like brief, interrelated events or quanta of energy in undetermined flux. Each figure does not live so much as he belongs to a system of relationship, where everything that happens is a symbol for other happenings, to be felt only as they bear upon still more remote happenings. His life is merely a function dependent on other functions, whose significance levels off into distances and circumstances quite beyond his comprehension, or, finally, concern. He becomes a trivial item in some vast equation of forces that tends to run down into an average condition, a compromise in inertia. And I do really like that because there is something profoundly, communal or post-humanist here, where human life is not the most important. It is itself a mere functional element in the system at large, and you shouldn't necessarily privilege any one. So that being said, I'll stop there. That's about an hour video on about 222 pages, so hopefully that gives you some helpful things for thinking about Pynchon. You can I'll put this all into, as we go through this series, into a playlist such that you can go through here and you can see whatever interests you, or you can go through the whole thing. This is just meant to be a semi-comprehensive, or at least wide-spanning resource for those who want it. So that being said, consider checking out any of my other videos that I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom that occurs once a month, and you can tailor that to your needs, whether you need help with some readings or talking about some sort of philosophy problem. It's at your behest. I also have super thanks available if you'd just like to give a one-time donation to the channel, because books are not cheap, and as a poor college student, I'd appreciate it very much. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.